So, as we continue in our Jesus Stories series, we're going to begin again with this idea that Jesus did things on purpose. In fact, everything he did on purpose and with purpose. And in particular, as we look at the collection of the stories that are told around the life of Jesus in the New Testament, we can see that one of the things in particular that Jesus did, he responded to people. He responded to different situations, to different things that were happening around him. And all of Jesus' response and responses, he does with purpose as well. And the question that I want to invite us to, lean into this morning is to think about this idea. How does Jesus respond to doubt? How does God respond to doubt? Now, most of us are pretty familiar with doubt. Sometimes we can doubt ourselves. We can doubt our ability to maybe pass an exam. We can doubt our qualifications as we get started in a new role at work. Sometimes we can doubt our ability when it comes to the sport that we love. Not me yesterday, though. I got to fill in for a friend's basketball team, and I made a three-pointer. Which for me is very good. I'm not a celebrated shooter, but I made a three. I was feeling pretty happy with myself. Now, I also happen to be playing with my friend Jordan, who made about 9 three-pointers. Comparison, of course, not a great thing to lean into for self-doubt, but I'm very proud of Jordan. Excellent shooter. It was so fun playing with you yesterday. But we can doubt ourselves sometimes. We can doubt others sometimes. We can doubt relationships that we're a part of. Doubt can enter our hearts and minds in so many different ways. And when it comes to this idea, ultimately, of believing in a God of love that sees us, knows us, and wants what's best for us, that can be a great source of doubt this morning as well. And a great question, whether you're brand new to faith, maybe you're here with a friend for the very first time, or maybe you've been living a life of faith for a long time. Sometimes we have doubts. And an incredible question to ask is, how does God respond to those doubts? Because our initial reaction might be that he's not going to respond well. Let's find out through this incredible story in the life of Jesus. And we're going to be going to Matthew chapter 11 and looking at another story. If you were here last week, we had another moment with Jesus and John the Baptist around the baptism of Jesus. And now we're going to jump ahead to another story in the life of Jesus connected to his friend John the Baptist. But to give you a little bit of context as we arrive at this story, and if you happen to miss last week, there's this incredible moment where John the Baptist is beginning to get the sense that Jesus of Nazareth is the promised Messiah, the Son of God that's going to make everything right between God and people. And John actually declares that he is the one. And then he has this incredible experience as he finally baptizes Jesus. And there's like an audible voice from heaven, the voice of the Father that says to John, "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased. I love him. He's my Son." So John has this miraculous experience with God as God gives him the evidence that this is Jesus. He's the Messiah. He's the promised Messiah that's now come. He is the Son of God. So John declares that truth, and he also experiences a really incredible evidence of that truth through his audible voice from God. Must have been amazing. You know what I love so much about the stories of the Bible, and in particular the New Testament, and the people of faith that believed so passionately in who Jesus was? It's remarkable how much the Gospels communicate that those same people of incredible faith also had doubts. And to me, I love that, because when we think about our own doubts, we can be reminded that we're in good company, that there's so many stories of people in faith in Scripture that have these moments of doubt. And as we head into chapter 11, John is experiencing a season of doubt in his life, even after all the miracles that he's seen. And we're going to pick up the story in Matthew 11 and verse 1. So after Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. When John, who was in prison, heard about the deeds of the Messiah, he sent his disciples to ask him. And this is the question that indicates where John's at in this moment. It's a question of doubt. He says, "Are you the one who is to come?" He's saying, "Are you the Messiah?" Remembering that John's already declared himself, "You are the Messiah." There's been an audible voice from heaven that's told him he is the Messiah. But now he experiences doubt. He says, "Are you the Messiah? Or should we expect someone else?" You know, sometimes when we think about faith and doubt, we can sometimes think that they're diametrically opposed. That if I'm a person of faith, by definition, I can never have doubt. Or if I'm a person of doubt, by definition, I can never have faith. But for those of us that have known God for some time, we know that's not really how it works. It's almost more like two lanes, that for me as a person of faith, that as I move forward in my life, there's two lanes that I can walk upon. A lane of faith or a lane of doubt. And at different times, I can take steps towards doubt or steps towards faith. The doubt is actually a part of a journey of faith. And Jesus understands this as it plays out here in the life of John. And for John, we learn that he's now imprisoned. We learn a little bit later on the source of his imprisonment, and it's not just. He challenged a ruler of the day named Herod, who had taken his brother's wife to be his own wife. And John calls him out. He said, that doesn't seem good. That's not right. And because of John speaking out truth, he's thrown into prison. And that prison is a place of pain. He's feeling the weight of that injustice. He's feeling the weight of the isolation of the prison cell, the cold, probably the hunger, the mistreatment perhaps. And in that place of pain, the voice of doubt comes. It says, "Are you really the one, or are we still waiting?" So faith and doubt. So a couple of weeks ago, and I'll try not to talk about New Zealand too much more after today, but I was in an apartment in Queenstown with my family, and there was an incredible view looking out over the lake, and I think we've got a photo of that we can put up here. Is my head in the way? It's probably slightly in the way. So this is Queenstown, and looking out over the lake, we could see that cool little forest over there, and then of course the mountain range. And if you're familiar with the place, those are the Remarkables. And every day I'd get up, and throughout the day I'd just look at that mountain range. And for me, living most of my life here in Perth, mountains just kind of captured my attention. It was just so different to see the snowy peaks, and each day I'd kind of measure how far down the snow had gone. I'd kind of try to remember where the different ridges and contours and different shapes of the mountain as I just spend time looking at it. And I did this day after day after day, just enjoying this incredible mountain, learning it better and better each morning as I had my cup of coffee, and later a cup of coffee, and a little later again another cup of coffee, just enjoying this incredible view. And then one day, the weather changed. And let's take a look at that next photo. And I don't know if it shows up too clearly, but the change in the weather caused the mountain just to completely disappear. So as I looked out over the lake, there's the forest, there's the little hill, but the entirety of the mountain was gone. And I'd never experienced this before, so in real time, I'm like, "Whoa, Tatch, boys, look at this. The mountain's disappeared." And Luke's like, "Where did it go?" And like it was a rainy day, and it was just kind of covered from the rain, the weather, the clouds, and it was as if the mountain was never there. Now, of course, I knew the mountain was there because day after day I'd been looking at the mountain. I'd been studying the mountain. I'd been looking at the different shapes, the ridges, how far the snow was. But if I'd just shown you that photo this morning, you might have said, "Oh, that's a nice lake, a nice forest, a little hill there." And you would have never known the mountain was there. So what John's experiencing, and what so often is the case where doubts emerge in my life, there's something that has changed in the conditions of my life that's made the mountain harder to see. And this is exactly what John's facing in this story. The conditions of his life have changed. There's an injustice, there's pain, and there's isolation. And those conditions have caused him to doubt what he has previously seen as truth. Now, many of us here this morning, we've experienced something that causes pain. We've experienced an injustice, whether it's just the pain of a change in health, It's not just, it's not fair. It causes pain, it can cause isolation. Maybe we've been involved in a conflict that produces those same things. Maybe there's been a loss of a role at work, whatever it might be. When we face these times of pain, isolation, often beginning with something that's not fair, it's one of those moments in life that can really cloud the mountain of God's presence. And we need to decide in those moments how we're going to respond to that. And what shapes my response to the clouds covering the mountain is Jesus' response to my doubt. So let's take a look at how Jesus responds to John. So in verse 4, he says this. Jesus replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight. The lame walk. Those who have leprosy are cleansed. The dead raised. The good news is proclaimed to the poor. Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." So what Jesus is doing here in these few verses, he's actually summarizing. If you go back and read the chapters leading up to chapter 11, he's kind of summarizing all the miracles that Jesus has done over the last period of his ministry. And what's really interesting is that so many of those things that he has done were actually signs prophesied of the Messiah that would come. 700 years earlier, the prophet Isaiah said these kind of things. The blind will see, the lame will walk, even the dead will rise. And a little earlier, there's a little girl who tragically dies, who Jesus restores to life. And then he finishes by saying, "Blessed is anyone who doesn't stumble on account of me." He recognizes that John is having a moment of stumble when it comes to his faith. I don't know about you, but I've had many moments in my life where I have stumbles. And here's how I'd begin to frame the response of Jesus to John's doubt. Ultimately, he responds with grace. The whole tone of Jesus' response here is grace and understanding. And this is the key thing we need to remember. If we're having any kind of doubt in our lives when it comes to the person of Jesus, when it comes to the fullness of who God is, maybe you're right at the start of that journey of faith, you're having doubts if God's even there. The first foundational piece to remember is that God's response to our doubt is always grace. And that's revealed through who Jesus is. And in everything he communicates here, it's a gracious response to serve John in the midst of his doubt. He responds with grace, and then he continues to affirm the truth. He says, here's what's happened. Blind see, lame walk, deaf hear, even the dead raised to life. All the signs of the prophets, which you know, John, they're here and now. He affirms the truth. Perhaps being aware of John's isolation in prison. Isolated from other people of faith, isolated from his own disciples. Jesus just reminds him of the truth of who he is. But then in verse 6, he also calls him back. From the position of grace, he says, here's the truth of who I am. He says, have faith in me again. The way he phrases it, is blessed is anyone who doesn't stumble on account of me or their faith in me. So there's an invitation to restore John's faith back into who Jesus is. And then there's a final piece of this. In verse 7, John's disciples, they're kind of packing up after Jesus has given them all this truth about who he is, this evidence of who he is as the Messiah. And as they're in the process of leaving, Jesus continues. And now he responds to the gathered crowd all around and not just John's disciples. And he goes on to say this. In verse 7, as John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began to speak to the crowd about John. So this is what Jesus has to say about John in his doubt. He says, what did you go out into the wilderness to see? John if you missed last week, he lived in the wilderness. He baptized people back into relationship with God, and he wore crazy clothes. He ate wild honey and locusts. He was a different kind of guy. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed swayed by the wind? If not, what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? No, those who wear fine clothes are in king's palaces. Then what did you go to see? A prophet. Yeah. I tell you, and more than a prophet, this is the one about whom it is written, again in Isaiah, I will send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way before you. It's just saying there's actually prophecy about not just Jesus, but who John is. And notice what Jesus is doing. He is pumping up John. And then he goes even further in verse 11. Truly I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist. This is the words of Jesus, just articulating how amazing he thinks John is. But then, of course, he goes on to say, yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he, revealing the heart of God that no man, no woman is greater than another. But here's what Jesus is doing. In a season of doubt in the life of John, he is affirming his identity as a man of faith. And this is the other way that Jesus responds to our doubt, is that he wants to remind us who we are. He wants to remind us how he sees us. Even if the cloud covers the mountain of God's presence, God wants to affirm the truth not only of who he is, but who we are in him. There's an incredible affirmation of John, even in this moment of weakness. And this morning as we gather together, you might be here with some kind of doubt in your heart. Doubt about who God is. Doubt about what God's doing in your life. Doubt about how God works or moves. And I want to tell you, the response of God to us is the same as the response of Jesus to John the Baptist. And this is why our gospel authors, inspired by the Spirit of God, preserve these stories. Because it's not just Jesus responding with purpose then and there. It's Jesus responding with purpose here and now. So I want to encourage you this morning. If there's doubt in your heart, here are some things that you need to remember about who Jesus is. He is the way and he is the truth. He is the one. He's the one that brings life and fullness of life to each of our hearts by faith through grace. That's who he is, and that's what he wants to speak into your heart, into your mind, into your soul this morning. He's the one. And he also wants to call you back. Maybe today you're feeling like you know the mountain's there. You've known in the past the mountain's there, but the clouds have covered it. And today it's time to ask Jesus to become clear once more. You know, sometimes the conditions of our lives are changed by external things that can lead us to doubt. Sometimes the conditions of our lives are changed by internal things that lead us to doubt. You know, I want to finish with this idea, and I glanced it through this story, that John's isolated in prison. And in that isolation, the doubt grows. Now, one of the things that I know I'm prone to, that I think all of us are prone to, when we're experiencing some kind of doubt, particularly when it's connected to some source of pain, often our response is to isolate, is to distance ourselves from not only God, but also people. Distance ourselves from church community. And sometimes the response to pain and doubt is to say, no, I just need to take a break from my church community, or I need to take a break from my Connect group, and I just need to step back. And I understand that response. So I've experienced feelings like that in the past myself. But what we actually need is to position ourselves around the articulation of truth. And that's what Jesus does for John in this story. It says, tell him all these things that have happened. And when we position ourselves around the articulation of truth, the mountain starts to become clearer again behind the cloud. And that's why I'm a pastor, because I believe in church communities. I believe in what we get to do together, serving one another as we seek God together. and build a foundation of faith in each other's lives. So I want to encourage you, if there's doubt, don't isolate yourself. Don't create a prison within your own heart. Return to God and know that his response to our doubt is always grace, truth, and love. I'm going to invite the team to come and join us, and we're going to create just a little bit of space here this morning. They're going to lead us in another song,